Alright, welcome back everyone. There is my WPL C24. I've decided to go ahead and put it back together because I made an entirely new chassis. I'm going to paint this one in pink and accessorize it and give it to my daughter. I'm going to use a turbo racing transmitter because it's nice and small for her small fingers and hands. So that way she can learn how to drive RC cars. She really gets excited every time I drive an RC car inside the house. She loves them. So I'm going to build this one up in pink. It is not totally finished yet. There are no electronics in there other than a motor. But I did do a suspension modification, as you can see right here. When I first lifted up the vehicle in one of the videos, that you could see that practically the whole vehicle tilted up on one side. So I've done that modification. This should work out a lot better than before. This is approximately 1.5 inches. This block of wood is approximately 1.5 inches. We come down here to the rear tire, and I push down on it slightly, and it is just barely touching the ground. So 1.5 inches is the maximum amount of flex, and yes, that tire in there is touching the ground, and of course that tire back there in the corner is touching the ground. So now with that out of the way, let's move on to what I really wanted to talk about, and that's the Gravedigger chassis for that truck right there. All right, and this, by the way, is a totally free modification. It didn't cost me anything. So if you buy this truck, you already have this truck, and you're disappointed with its results, I've already made a video on how to modify the springs and the shocks to give you this amount of travel. So now onto this. For the first time ever in my history, I'm going to give you some very basic measurements on this vehicle. So that way if you want to follow along, and you may see some funky cutouts on this vehicle, like on the top side right here, and you might see some extra holes drilled in places where they don't need to be drilled. And that's because I used the WPL chassis and all its plastic bits to assemble it. Like there's a spacer that goes from the right to the left. I mean, technically if you're looking at it, it would be right, left, like that. But so I used that. That would have been the servo tray area, and then I used the spacer that went from the rear, which is this plastic joker right here, right? So that's what I originally used to mock up, was all of these plastic bits. That one down there is going to be harder to see, but anyway, I think you get the idea. I decided to change the ride height, the suspension geometry, because I think these oil-filled shocks, although very nice, are still too stiff. So from 90 degrees, right? 90 degrees is like the letter L, right? We got the horizon, we got the vertical, and then I split it in half to approximately 45 degrees. Don't go 46, 47, 48. Don't go beyond 45 degrees. Go like, you can go 43, 42, 41, 20, 13, whatever you want, or straight up and down. You start going beyond 45 degrees, then you're going to become counterproductive, and your suspension might not work properly at all. Right, so don't go beyond 45 degrees. On hers and my daughter's, I put the spring shock mechanism back in a total vertical position, right, where it was originally located. Maybe hard to see that on camera, but it is in this straight up and down. Because the body, unless I wanted to modify the body will not allow me to mount them at a 45-degree angle, so keep that in mind. So the overall length of this guy and the width, let me give you those measurements. So the overall length from front to rear, the rear indicated by these 3 tightly spaced holes, is approximately 10 3/16 or 260 millimeters. The height, which is from the top to the bottom, is approximately 2 inches or 50 millimeters. The width from left to right or right to left, depending which way you look at it, is approximately 2 1/16 or 52 millimeters. None of these measurements actually mean anything in all actuality. This will give you a good baseline to get started. I'm not going to include measurements for all of these holes because more than likely if you're building the Gravedigger, you're not going to use any of the holes that were in this WPL anyway, right? Like for example, I got 2 screws here for this custom mounted battery tray, but we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what do you see here? You got 1 screw with a nut right there, and you got 1 screw with a nut right there, which is represented on the same other side. But the thing I would say is keep your links, your rear links parallel up and down. And keep your front links parallel up and down. And again, don't go beyond a 45-degree angle from the horizon. You can go up higher, but don't go down lower, right? Don't go lower than 45 degrees. And that should get you started. And again, this is 2 inches. All I did was I drew a straight line all the way across from the top of this frame rail. And then I drew 2 inches down, which happens to actually coincide with this old table saw fence. Right, so I took the chassis and I traced it out, and you can kind of see where I scraped the paint, where it kind of takes that curve. Then it kind of stops right there. But I decided to change the suspension, dog hair, or no, that's hot glue. Change the suspension geometry, and so I put a 45-degree angle on there, and then I drew it straight down. It may be hard to discern that in camera. There it is. So straight across, 45-degree angle, then drew it down. Right. So this was a totally free upgrade. At least the chassis part is, but you can always make it out of a sheet of aluminum, steel, whatever the case may be. I bent this particular piece over a board. I clamped it in place, then bent it with my fingers, and then you used a hammer with light tapping motions to get a nice tight fold, bend, crease, whatever you want to call it. So that is also another route. This is very cheap, and this is just a piece of the aluminum right here, right? Just a piece of aluminum. And that's all this was. I've used a piece of this. I've already cut a piece for my ESC, my battery box. That's why this is left over, right? I can still use that maybe for something else. So that you may not need to spend anything at all. So what I would do if you're on a budget, I'd just buy the rear axle, the front axle. If you want rear steer, buy 2 front axles. And then drill the holes where you think you need them. And again, if you need to take a screenshot, snapshot, or hit pause and write them down, then you're just going to drill your own holes where you think they're necessary. And I'll give you a slow kind of a view. My motor is mounted on this side. There's no screw holes on the other side because of my particular application. That's the way it ended up being. Alright, so my transmission actually sits down lower than that truck as well. And as you can see over here, there are no motor mounts over here, and I have extra holes I didn't need. So learn from my mistakes. They're not necessarily mistakes. Everything is a learning experience, really. But I save you the time because cutting out this frame didn't do any good. Cutting out the frame over there didn't do any good. Cutting that out didn't do any good in the end because it didn't do what I wanted it to do for my Gravedigger build. It just helped me get to where I am today. So now I have a spare chassis if I want to remake it. Right now, I do not feel like cutting this out and redoing it. All I simply did was after I traced it out, then I took my rotary tool with a cutoff wheel and I went down the center. That gave me a left and a right piece. Other than that, I hope you guys get something from that. You can probably find a table saw fence for pretty cheap at your secondhand store or maybe a garage sale or something like that. Or again, just use a piece of sheet metal or aluminum and fold it yourself over a block of wood and call it done. None of these measurements are important. This just gives you a rough idea. In fact, if I was to remake this chassis again, I'd take 5 millimeters off the front and 5 millimeters off the rear. That way the Gravedigger body, in my opinion, would fit a little bit better.